Medical materialism and the allopathic paradigm, comparing that to shamanic practices. I did a 2-year fellowship with Dr. Weil at the University of Arizona in Integrative Medicine, and then moved into this PhD because I can't possibly get enough education, I guess. And my wife is really on me about that, but you can't be satisfied. We're both OBGYNs, so we share quite a bit. So what this study was for me, if you look at Holger Kalwait and what he described as the current state, now this was in '87, but I think it still rings true today, is that the current state of our medical system is bureaucratized, materialistic, and a mechanical model with an active therapist, meaning the doctor is telling the patient what to do and the patient is doing it. Now that is changing a little bit. In my own practice, I have many patients telling me what to do and where to go. But I think that's changing, whereas in a shamanic practice, the shaman is more of a passive participant and the patient is more of the active participant healing themselves. And at Marshall Block, who is a physician in Arizona, there was an issue of the Arizona Medical Society newsletter that came out, and it was titled Allopathic or Allopathetic. And the gist of this newsletter was that spirituality and that type of healing has absolutely no place in medical practice. And Dr. Block is basically, it sounds like he's for spirituality, but he's saying that the care of the patient community has been replaced with business reports and evidence-based medicine. And evidence-based medicine cuts both ways. I do think it has a great purpose in showing us what works and what doesn't work, but it also throws a lot of things out that do work, maybe on even an anecdotal level. Block also was the one that basically said that we're allopathetic, and he did use the word quack if you use spirituality in your medical practice. Ken Wilber, the basis of this comparison between shamanism and allopathic medicine is basically the pre-trans issue, the pre-rational, trans-rational issues that Wilber discusses in the pre-trans fallacy, where physicians and scientists tend to reduce things to a scientific level or a pre-rational level, and people that look at New Age and maybe shamanic healing may elevate everything to a trans-rational state and discredit the science. So I think that somewhere in between, and that's where I was going with what this study was. And then William James, he didn't obviously say this in 2002, but it was a reprint. Medical materialism, if we look at some of our past people, St. Paul was an epileptic, St. Teresa was a hysteric, and St. Francis was a hereditary degenerate. That's what we make all of these experiences out to be. And you're laughing with me, I'm sure, not at me. But the purpose of my study, and what I did was, there's a rotation at the University of Arizona where medical students and residents come from around the United States to spend a month there and learn about integrative medicine. And integrative medicine is basically everything. So they're going through Ayurveda, a little acupuncture, their energy work, they're doing all kinds of things. And so what I did was I added a 3-day thing at the end of their rotation if they wanted to go, where I took them up to Sedona for 3 days. Basically paid for it all myself too, but we won't go into that. For 2 of those days, we did shamanic work. And basically what I then did after we did these 48 hours where I didn't allow them to sleep, which is basically the life of a resident physician anyways, I used this in a grounded theory and basically where I just immersed myself in the data that I was collecting and from my own experiences from where they were at and going through not only the allopathic paradigm but into this integrative paradigm. So what I looked at initially was the stages of shamanic training and comparing it to the stages of allopathic training, and they're fairly similar. Mircea, I'm going to try to pronounce this, Mircea Eliade, depending on how you want to pronounce it. There's 3 levels that he came up with: calling and election, initiation, and shamanic practice. The calling for shamans can be anywhere from hereditary, injury, tragedy, or tribal needs. The initiation rites basically come through different forms as well, and they can be cultural. In one practice, the initiation in Korea, I believe, they make shamans stand under a cold waterfall for 11 hours. And that sounds like residency to me. I don't know if Larry would agree to that, but there is some being pummeled in residency. So there were some similarities there. They can also be initiated simply by instantaneous. They may be struck by lightning or have a seizure. The wounded healer archetype is there, and dismemberment is obviously metaphorical. If they were dismembered, they probably wouldn't be doing much. But the metaphorical dismemberment, where they might go on a shamanic a voyage into the wilderness for 3-4 days without food, and then come back, and they'll go through this dismemberment where they're ripped apart metaphorically and then put back together. And then the shamanic practice, where they go out into the community. There's a story of a tribal, an Asian tribe, I can't remember the name, where after they go through the initiatory rites and they practice for a couple of years, they have to sit in front of 4 elder shamans and actually heal patients. And the elders then tell them whether or not they can join the club, and that sounds like my boards. And then once you get the piece of paper that says you're in the club, you don't know what to do with it after that. But yeah, it's this process of initiation and working through things. The allopathic training is similar. We have a calling. They can be called basically through your heritage. My wife and I are both physicians. My 2 oldest kids are 16 and 18. They want to be doctors, despite seeing how miserable we are at times. So I think that obviously that plays a huge factor. But there's also the ideals of income, job stability, things of that nature. The education and training is very similar. Like I talked about, there's stages of training: medical school, residency, practice. And then we also learn through, physicians, I think we take it for granted and maybe we don't realize it, but we have a lot of ceremony and ritual in medicine. And I have a paper that's coming out, and I'm going to plug myself if that's okay, in Explore in September, that's on the rituals of, basically it's the surgical suite as a sacred ritual. And if you look at surgery, what other place in healing do we have a patient laying on a table in a Christ-like position, unconscious, basically close to death, and then brought back to life at the end? I mean, it's quite an amazing ceremony, and I think we take it for granted. And so there are a lot of similarities with the ceremonies and ritual, but I think we've lost it all. And because we're into being here at 2 o'clock, and I've got 5 surgeries today and things of that nature. And then the initiation, as I've spoken about, is very hierarchical in medicine, and I think that in shamanic training it's very similar. So this is a pilot study, and Julie Beischel reminded me to say things are a pilot. No, I'm just kidding. Because it was a very small study, and it can definitely be carried out farther. But I had 32 students, and we spent 48 hours in Sedona, which is so horrible to be in Sedona. But basically we were outside, and so I think we weren't staying at a great hotel. And we hiked up to some abandoned Hopi ruins where you can see the fire varnish still on the rocks. There's a lot of hieroglyphics still there, so it's a pretty neat place with a lot of energy. And we did drumming for 4 to 6 hours, where we would just literally drum, bang on rocks, basically got cavemanish, if you will. And then with James Andretti, who's an author, he's spent about 10 to 15 years living with the Huichol, and he's gone through their initiation rites. We did some healing of each other while we were drumming for another couple of hours. We didn't do much in the way of talking. We slept outside. The next day, we went through a fire ceremony. This is the picture of us drumming in the rocks. And the next day, the next evening, when everybody was basically spent physically and emotionally, we went through a fire ceremony, which we all sit around a fire, and everybody that's around the fire is actually a part of the fire. So anything that's said stays with the fire and goes up. And people were going through their lives, and we were going through all kinds of things. And then after that I interviewed all the students. Now, I used grounded theory because basically the theory is grounded in your data. And for me, obviously there's a bias because I was one of them. I've been through what they've been through. But I think that bias, which in grounded theory you have a bias because it's grounded in your data, but it's both subjective and objective. And I was basically able to come up with some theories based on what I was hearing from these students. So what I got from the students was 16 of them had one or both parents that were physicians. 16 just claimed that the vocation itself, they just wanted to be a doctor for whatever reason. None of them actually stated that they felt like their personal wounds were part of why they became a physician. And I think for myself, a future study would be, I think that personal wounds do have a significant influence on why we do what we do. And I think that it helps us choose why we go into what we go into as doctors. And I'll tell you about why I went into OB that I discovered amongst this trip. 50% stated that they were skeptical of shamanism when they started. But at the conclusion, most of them they said they had an increased sense of self-awareness, and they felt that the healing ritual that we did, that banging on the rocks, being together, made them feel like a group that they hadn't felt the whole month that they were doing this rotation together. They also felt like their hearing and their sense of touch was heightened. It wasn't measurable, but it was just something that they reported. And that they felt like that they definitely had a better sense of what shamanism or indigenous healing practices were, and they felt that this helped them connect to their own healing practice. Indigenous shamans, what I found in looking at my data was that we saw some of the similarities between doctors and shamanic training, but what was one of the main differences? Well, one of the main differences that I saw was that shamans heal in the communities where they live. They grow up there, they stay there, they train there, they know everybody. They may live on the outskirts of town, but they live there. Doctors, what do? We go somewhere, we might move 3-4 times before we even go to medical school, but we go to medical school, 4 years later we go to residency, 4 years later we go and live somewhere else. We may live 20-30 miles from where we practice. And so we really don't live in the community where we practice. And some of us may even change practices 4 or 5 times in locations. So that's a huge thing that I think that would I recommend that doctors just live in the hometown where they grew up? I don't know if that would work, but I think that's definitely one thing that we could look at with our healing practices is maybe why we're disconnected as physicians. And then basically the conclusions, other conclusions, Poland and Kosovic say medical schools have an important role in reducing the isolation of their students from alternative health beliefs like shamanism that are part of our community. We need to try to somehow bring these together. I think Dr. Weil has tried to do this to a certain extent, but you know, there's other ways of doing this. Rachel Remen has brought in compassion into medical schools, but we don't really get a lot of this when we're training, and we definitely don't get this in residency. Residency, you are dismembered, almost literally at times, and so I think that's part of why we have this disconnect. But I think what I was looking at with this, the bonfire of the paradigms, was that we are always looking forward at technology in medicine, and maybe we should look backwards at maybe where we came from and why we came from there. The continuation of spirituality in medicine, I believe, is a critical conduit to the healing of the physician. And I think that I think if you don't come into medicine wounded, you probably leave wounded when you come out of residency. Jung said that we could say without too much exaggeration that a good half of every treatment that probes at all deeply consists in the doctor's examining himself for only what he can put right in himself can he hope to put right in the patient. It is no loss either if he feels that the patient is hitting him or even scoffing him. It is his own hurt that gives the measure of his power to heal. The more wounded you are, the more powerful you might heal. And Robert Ramanujan at Pacifica wrote a book called The Wounded Researcher. And he talks about this as well, that students can sometimes put out some really good research based on their own personal wounds. Sorry about that. Looking at this aspect of it at the end of this, I was doing a genogram, which is where I was looking at my family tree, and for 3 generations back. And in that genogram, I was looking at there was conflict lines. I drew conflict lines between almost every maternal bond in my family. And when I saw that, I was like, gosh, you know, why did I go into OBGYN? People always ask me, you know, why did you go into OBGYN? And I always say, because I didn't like any of the other rotations. But you know, sometimes you look at this, and on a deeper level, sometimes you can't answer it. And so as I looked at this genogram, and I saw all these connections between mothers and children that were just conflict, grandmothers and their kids, and I said, well, there was one thing that I came up with that was a little, could be potentially disturbing, and another that made a lot of sense. And the disturbing one is that in medicine, in GYN, I do hysterectomies, and I'm actually cutting out the maternal organ. and the birthing organ, the organ that, my mom and I did not have a good relationship. And so that kind of disturbed me. I was like, well, hopefully that's not the reason that I went into this. But on a subconscious level, you could see where that might be something to look at, something to examine. And the other thing that I saw, though, was that obviously if there's this maternal-child conflict in my family, at least for the last 3 generations, me going into OB is probably a way for me to heal those ancestral wounds in my family. I'm trying to figure out this whole, I'm surrounded by women, and I'm surrounded by women and children all the time. And by immersing myself in that, I think on a subconscious level, I was trying to heal my wounded healer. And so I think that shamanic practice and the wounded healer archetype can really give us some insight, if not into anything else, to maybe why we do the things that we do as doctors. And so, like I said, it's a small study. I would like to do something in the future looking at that wounded archetype and talking to physicians about that, and there's stories out there. My PhD is on the life of Larry Dawsey. I'm doing interviews with Larry, and I'll tell you, just spending time with somebody like him has helped me immensely understand my medicine and what I do. And I think in all of our professions, if we look to the people in our past that have come up the ranks before us, that are the luminaries, it can help us understand ourselves a little bit better and hopefully help us heal better. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Rich Ulrey. A week ago, I had a female patient that was in labor. Prior to labor, she was going to have the pubis symphysis bone separate, so we convinced her to get a C-section. And with the biome research coming out, we actually convinced the OB in the hospital to allow us to swab birth canal fluids all over the baby an hour after it was born. I just would like a comment on that approach.
The fact that you were able to convince an OB to do anything outside of the norm is amazing to me. And I consider myself pretty open-minded. The fact that they were going to consider separating her pubis symphysis is fascinating to me. I wouldn't ever even consider that in a million years. But I guess your question about the after part of doing the fluids and things like that, I've worked with a lot of nurses. Nurses tend to be very, they're way better than doctors at being open towards different healing modalities. I will greatly admit that. We have nurses that do a lot of aromatherapy in the rooms, and they'll do things like they'll put peppermint or something up by the shoulders, and then they'll put it down on the perineum, and so the baby's familiar with the smells and things. And I said, well, one of my partners said, well, they're coming out by the bottom. Why don't you put some of that up there too? And so that's the mentality. But I agree with you. I think that, if you look at things like placenta, I had a family that was Navajo, and they put the blood on their faces after the baby was born, and they put some on the baby. And I think, I don't know enough about the biome theory to be perfectly honest to make a comment about that, but I do think that it helps with bonding. I think that anything like that can help with bonding.
Well, that was a first for northern Michigan, if not Michigan.
I can't imagine it was a first probably in the United States, but in an OB ward, maybe in a birthing center, but an OB ward for sure. That's great.
Thank you.
Hello, Emery Mort is my name. Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. And
Thank you.
I think your work's really courageous, and I just want to thank you and those who have helped you.
Well, I do have to look behind my back a lot, so when I'm at the hospital.
So I'm actually going to ask a fairly broad question. I've been interested in healing through lucid dreams, also healing through use of psychoactive substances, let's say mushrooms. And I was interested in the observation of the students who went on the vision quest with you, who noticed an increase in their ability in sensory feeling and also auditory ability. This is actually something that's lucid dreamers and things often experience a very similar thing. Also, this is a noted and documented product of mushroom intake. Have you noted this kind of correlation? And would you say that the shamanic journeying that you're able to do and that you've noticed is akin to these other practices, or?
I haven't taken mushrooms,
Well, yeah.
but I'd try them if I had somebody that knew what they were doing. But no, I hear what you're saying. I think that what happened, I think, when we were doing the drumming, and I think, if you look at Charlie Tart's work on altered states of consciousness, that puts you into an altered state of consciousness. I don't know enough about the brain waves to tell you which ones are being, but I know after 6 hours you are not in your normal state of mind, hungry and tired, and then this rhythmic beating. I spent some time in Brazil in November and worked with the mediums there, and John of God. I spent some time there. And one of the things that the mediums do when they start their work there is they do what's called a palmatreya, which is where they snap their fingers to get into an altered state. And I think that altered state, obviously if you're under the psychedelic, you're going to be there for hours versus maybe if you're doing it with drumming and whatnot. But I have a theory really quick on, Rick Strassman's work with LSD, and
with DMT.
Yes, with DMT. That's what I meant. Thank you for correcting me. And the interesting thing is, shamans will talk about traveling the axis mundi to the spirit world when they do like ayahuasca or iboga. And when you're watching a woman in labor who's about 7 or 8 centimeters and she's unmedicated, the pain kind of goes away for a little while, and I've seen their eyes roll up and they go somewhere. I don't know where they go, but they go somewhere. And I wonder that there's some literature that shows that DMT is released, at times when there is intense pain or at birth, things of that nature. And I'm curious, and I don't think I could ever get an IRB to approve this, but to draw levels of, to look at that, is the mother traveling the axis mundi at that point in time to connect with her baby's spirit and bring this kid into the world. It sounds kind of out there, but where else could I say it but here, right? So, but I think there's something to that, and I think that altered state that you're talking about, I don't know, as being a physician, if that would help me as a healer, in the sense that I might lose my license, but I do think that if we can get there through other means, and I've been invited to ayahuasca ceremonies in Tucson secretively, and haven't been able to go. But I do think it would be interesting but I'm afraid of that. Dan Pinchbeck wrote a book called Breaking Open the Head, and that's why I titled my talk that, because when you do a substance like that, are you going to go to heaven or hell? I think with Aldous Huxley wrote that book, where are you going to go? And so you got to have a guidance, and doctor, we don't have that because we don't go that way usually, but thanks for that question. Sorry for my long-winded answer.
I'm Paul Hansen, and I just wanted to affirm the notion of knowing your own wounds. 50-some years ago, I was doing an internship at the Topeka State Hospital and Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas. And when the new crop of residents would come in, the joke for the first week or so was, well, what's your wound that brings you here? What's your problem that brings you here? And over many, many years of doing psychotherapy, being aware of my own woundedness and the nature of those, and that awareness kept growing, enabled me not only to keep on healing, but to be a more powerful healer, as you said, for your patients. Thank you.
I wish we could be a 30-year-old doctor with a 60-year-old experience level, Yeah. Just like I say, I wish I could have been a 40-year-old father with a 20-year-old body, but that doesn't work very well either.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.